Hi, friends. My name is Kurt Willems, and I am the host of Theology Curator, and I wanted to let you know about a really exciting conference that's going to be available to anyone who wants to go deep into the area of Christology in the month of November. On November 18th, it begins, and you are invited to an interdisciplinary conference where 70 world-leading scholars in biblical studies, theology, and philosophy will gather to discuss the person and work of Jesus. Amongst many others, conference attendees will hear from the likes of N.T. Wright, Catherine Sonderegger, Douglas Campbell, Lucy Pepiot, Stanley Hauerwas, Catherine Tanner, Richard Bauckham, Andrea White, Ian McFarland, Grace G. Soon Kim, and Philip Ziegler, and so many others. For details, go to ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com and hit up the About page. ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com. You can also figure out how to sign up there, and it's also possible that there are scholarships and reduced entry for folks who may have financial barriers to this event. So, hope you'll check it out. And my friends, I hope you'll check out this conversation we are having on politics during the era of Trump and beyond. Let's go.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome back to the show. Today, I am so excited to share with you an interview that happened on Election Day with Jonathan Walton, Susie LaHood, and Cy Hoekstrup. These are the editors of a volume called Keeping the Faith, Reflections on Politics and Christianity in the Era of Trump and Beyond. And this is a really timely volume. I mean, it is very timely. And it's timely in the way that no matter how this election works out, this is an anthology of various articles that give voice to dissenting positions from some versions of conservative Republican Christianity. Yes. And that includes people who are conservative and Republican, by the way. So this is definitely not a monolithic voice, but has many voices from many perspectives wrestling with what does it mean to follow Jesus during this era we find ourselves in. The one thing they probably hold in common is that having Trump as the representative of a Christian politician has been very damaging to our faith. Not just reputation, not just poor rhetoric, but on the ground, policy and posture have caused real damage to real people. That, I think, is consistent in all of these articles. To give you an idea, a few people who have endorsed the book, you got Dr. Ron Sider, someone I really respect. You've got Sandra Maria Van Opstal, who is the executive director of Chasing Justice, and you have Dr. Walter Brueggemann. So lots of chatter about this book already, and some really important contributions, including one by David French, Randall Ballmer, the editors themselves, Randy Woodley. I'm just looking through here and finding Jesse Wheeler, people that I have come to respect or have even, some of them, been on this podcast in the past. Mark Scandrette is someone who I've hung out with a couple of times and really respect. Andy Crouch. So there's a lot of very good work that has gone into this, and I think it is important in such a time as this. So if you want to learn more about the book, go to keepingthefaithbook.com. That's keepingthefaithbook.com. You can see a list of all of the contributors and so much more over there. I hope you will check that out as you listen to this interview. I want to welcome you back to the podcast. This is Kurt Willems, and I am sitting across the interwebs from three really awesome people that I've been getting to know for the last bit here. And they are Jonathan Walton, Susie LaHood, and Cy Hoekstra. And they are the editors of a new book called Keeping the Faith, Reflections on Politics and Christianity in the Era of Trump and Beyond. I want to welcome you all here. It's so good to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah. You bet. And, what's really exciting, and, one of the things about this book that really interests me, and we were sort of talking about before, is the word beyond, because we want to make a very clear statement that this conversation is relevant after the results of this election, because really it's about a big political landscape that has been true for Christians in this country, at least, for a very long time. We'll talk about the details of that. And so I appreciate a volume that challenges us to notice one particular point in time that brings some of these issues to this obvious place of surface for some people, but that these are really just symptoms of a bigger conversation, a bigger reality. And I'll look forward to processing some of that with all of you. But before I do, I'd love to hear a little bit about each of you. Maybe give us 30 seconds to a minute, just a little background on what you have been up to and how that connects to political things in this project. And, it's about Jesus, so you can tie that in however you feel like you want to. Let's start with maybe Susie. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Susie LaHood. I grew up as a missionary kid in Uzbekistan. My dad was a pastor, did pastoral work in the States for several decades, and then we moved overseas. I then moved back to the States for undergrad and then ended up back in the Middle East in Lebanon, where I worked and lived for 7.5 years, the last 5 of which were in response to the humanitarian crisis due to the conflict in Syria. So my professional background is as a humanitarian worker, managing relief and development projects in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. But after several years of doing that, I felt the need and desire to pivot more towards the political sphere. And a lot of that was just frustration of some of the bigger issues that you were sort of constantly hitting your head up against as you're trying to provide humanitarian assistance. And so I came back to the States to do my master's at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. And I think a lot of us had been stewing in these ideas for a while, even prior to 2016. And then a lot of this came to a head in 2016. And then very recently, just in the past few months, felt like we needed to take a strong stand around the issues that we talk about in this book. So that's kind of what led me to this point that we're at now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And looking forward to hearing more about your own unique contribution to the project itself. And Jonathan, talk to us a little bit. Tell us about your story and your connection to this work.
So my name is Jonathan. I am, I'm right now I'm a dad. I am presently monitoring Storybots and lunch that's happening.
I feel you. I get it.
And I work in full-time campus ministry and have been for the last 12 years. So right out of college, did that. But poetry and writing and performance is my actual trained kind of background out of Columbia University. And the reason that I was really passionate about this project, I wrote a book called 12 Lies That Hold America Captive in 2018. And I think that was a big picture book, this kind of the ideas behind it being white American folk religion and the distinction between what we see in dominant Christian culture in America versus what is actually in the Bible. But I think when I particularly got the phone call from Cy, who I'm grateful who invited me to be a part of it, and then talking with Susie and she sold me on everything she was trying to do, is that I think many of the authors was looking for a place to voice my biblical discontent with what was happening. I read a tweet from Trump about redlining the day that she called me. And I know what redlining is about. If you shout out to suburban women, you're saying get away from Black people. And I think 1 second, Maya. Baba gave me the quietser in 1 second. And so when that happened, I think there was a conduit for all that energy in a way that was biblical and helpful. And so I'm really grateful to be able to write something that's relevant, to be able to write something that is enduring. Because I think that's a hard thing to do. And I'm really glad we were able to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks for that intro. And I definitely have your book. So, yeah, it's cool to see that you're kind of building a bridge from that big picture stuff to this work here. So glad to have you on the show. And Sai, talk to us. Tell us a little bit of your background and your connection to these lovely people in this book.
Sure. So I'm Sai. I grew up kind of around the Midwest in New Jersey, mostly in the suburbs. And then when I was about just before I turned 13, the company that my dad worked for was bought by a Swiss company, and we were moved over to Switzerland, where I lived from 8th grade through the end of high school. And I then went to college in New York City, where I met Jonathan just during my first week, my orientation week as a freshman. We ended up in the same Christian fellowship together. So we've known each other for a long time. And then Susie, we, as Jonathan said, we both just met her a few months ago when we started working on this project. A mutual friend connected us. And, you know, I really wanted to get involved in this project for a number of different reasons. But I think they've mostly been recounted by the other two, honestly. I think a lot of people, we heard this from a lot of our authors, that when we reached out to everyone trying to solicit pieces, was that people were just excited to say something. Excited might even be the wrong word. They felt a need to say something, and were happy to have an outlet to do so, happy to have a place to contribute to something where it's, people coming from a whole lot of different backgrounds, from within the evangelical and a few from outside of the evangelical tradition, from different ethnicities, different places across the US, like just different locations, different political backgrounds growing up. Like, people wanted to contribute to something where it was a lot of Christians like that as a chorus saying that like, we have gotten to a place with our politics where we really don't want to be, where we are idolizing power and greed and all kinds of other things. And so I was just excited to be a part of that, even though at the time we didn't really have any idea how it would turn out when we started the project. But
sure.
We started just reaching out to people, and people were very enthusiastic and got pieces to us, mostly original pieces, right? The vast majority of the pieces in this book are original content, and people got them to us very quickly, very excitedly. And we had I don't know, 6-8 weeks where we were working really, really hard to get everything edited and put together. And we now just have a book that I'm really proud of.
Yeah. No, I mean, as I thumbed through it and I've kind of exposed myself to some of the articles and all that, like, I recognize a lot of names in this book. Like, this is a significant work. This isn't, just a couple of friends who threw something together. This is a substantial contribution. And, and so I'm really excited to kind of unpack sort of what you actually see this book being used for. Maybe that's where we can start. How does this book particularly contribute to this conversation about Christians and the political reality we find ourselves in 2020 and beyond? And knowing that, we're more polarized than we think we've been, at least on the surface. Yet there's a lot of energy from to be stereotypical. I don't know if I don't have facts or anything, but I mean, younger evangelicals are actually asking questions about these issues, right? Like there's a whole movement of people that grew up with one particular lens who are saying, what about all that Sermon on the Mount stuff? Why do we have policies that hurt people in the Middle East and claim that it's God's will? Like, why do we have a history and legacy of racial injustice? And I'm just hearing about it. Some people I've known are just like, I'm just waking up to the fact that this is even a thing this year. Like there are so many different layers to, I think, new awarenesses in, I would say, white and evangelical, curious people. And yet at the same time, there is a new wave of, I don't know how to put it, resistance I usually use in the positive sense, but this is a sort of backlash to asking these really important questions around justice and peacemaking. And so, talk to us about this book and how it really is seeking to speak into that. You can highlight a couple of the pieces if you'd like, or whatever just feels natural. And maybe we'll keep our order consistent for now, and we can mix it up as you feel like you want to interject. Feel free. But Susie, what would you say to sort of the purpose of this book and how it might be useful for someone who picks it up?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, there's just so much in the book to unpack. And I'm so thankful to everyone who contributed to this sort of symphony of voices that came together. And we are framing it as an anthology of dissent. So calling out some of the real idolatry that we've seen build up in the church over the past decades, calling out this unholy alliance of the church with a single political party, which history has shown us time and time again is such a danger to society when something like that happens. And when that kind of uncritical political engagement happens, and calling out some of the sort of, quite frankly, hypocrisy that you pointed out of claiming to be followers of Christ while espousing a political ethic that is so counter to the teachings of Christ, the core teachings of Christ.
Yeah. And
so when we first talked about what we wanted this book to be, some of the ways that we were framing it were an opportunity to critique the dominant narrative, to try to reimagine how Christians should engage politically, and to try to reverse this trend that we're seeing in the church and head in a direction that we feel is more in line with the rule and reign of God. And just also calling out this current narrative that being a Christian means that you fall in the Trump camp and all that Trumpism represents. Yeah. But that's really just a moment and almost just sort of a case study for these idolatries that have taken root in the church. That's really just, as you said, us seeing the fruit come out of that. And quite frankly, in one sense, this was kind of, at least on my part initially, kind of a last ditch effort at saying, you know what, I know there are more Christians out there who feel the same way that I do. And I know that there are more Christians out there who are frustrated and who are in mourning and lament and who want to be able to put pen to paper and express what they feel is core biblical truth and express more of what they feel are their core values as Christ followers. But at the same time, this conversation does extend beyond this moment because you can't undo decades of bad teaching in the church and bad discipleship and false narratives and distorted lenses. You can't undo that in a single moment. And so we hope that this is the start of a bigger conversation and in a continuation for those who have already been having these kinds of conversations. But there's certainly so much more that needs to be done, so much hard work that we need to dig in and do, regardless of the outcome of the election today.
Absolutely. With some of the people in our community, we've talked about, most of us are voting Biden for various reasons, but noticing that, that doesn't change the fact that there's work to be done. That doesn't change the fact that there are systemic issues or things that Biden represents that we don't necessarily want to uphold either, But at the end of the day, how can we become people who, through our vote, love our neighbors and then go on with the work of actually doing the love, And so No, Susie, thank you so much for giving voice to that. And Jonathan, I'd love to hear some of your perspective on what you're hoping this book can be for people as this continues, this conversation continues.
Yeah, I think that, for me, when I was on sabbatical from July 1, 2019 to July 1, 2020, off social media, off everything.
Wow.
Doing research on white evangelicalism through an intellectual history of Jerry Falwell and like his stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think coming back, looking at the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, Southern Virginia, where I'm from, and actually seeing a microcosm for what's happening right now. And so that's a really big picture way of saying that, like, the gospel is consistently distorted when it is joined with institutional power, not just political power, but when it's tied to institutional power and instituted in a way that, doesn't look out for the poor, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, then you get idolatry. That's just what has happened, right? And so I think for me, why I said yes to the book was the president of our organization, or assistant to the president of our organization, the regional director, one of the board members said to me, "Hey, we need a resource to give students, for the election."
Yeah.
And so I was like, "Well, I don't have anything." And then Susie called me, right? And so I want to be able to give the group of people that has not been discipled into biblical Christianity, but discipled into white American folk religion, which looks like Christian nationalism, which looks like white nationalism, and stuff, which looks like identity politics, like looks like that, right? Like, what are we going to give this student that says, who is Jesus? Because we cannot give him or her the majority of most of the books that come out of seminaries right now, because they don't answer the questions that are pertinent for today. They don't. And that's not, I've gotten to a point I think is more mature when I stop blaming the people that I'm looking at and look at the leaders that they're downstream of. Right. And like, it is, Jesus said, like, we have to judge a tree by the fruit that it bears. And so I can't get angry at an apple. I can't.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't make itself, right? So I can get frustrated at Jerry Falwell Jr., but I need to look at his dad.
Yeah.
I need to look at his father. And the reality is Jerry Falwell's father killed his brother. And Jerry Falwell's father had a dogfighting ring, a gambling ring, and ran moonshine all over DC, Southern Virginia, and North Carolina. And the reality is these people come from broken families. And Jerry Falwell went to a seminary where they taught segregation as the will of God, where they taught marrying outside your race as against the will of God, where they said that he lived in a state where I'm from, where there was a debate about whether or not Black people have souls. He lived in a state where they forcefully forcefully sterilized 15,000 women for being imbeciles, right? Like stupid, being poor and stupid. There's a case like Buck versus Bell where like these are the laws that we hang out with, right?
Wow.
And so every generation, I think, needs a resource that says this is who Jesus is. This is what an apostle looks like. This is what a prophet looks like. This is what women of God look like, what men of God look like. And I think we've been able to do that with this resource. Like, there's a generation of people that have a generation of people that came before them to look up to follow Jesus. And so I am glad to be a part of that.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. And, there's several things that you said there, but one of the things that I think you highlight is this is the kind of volume that I think a seminary class on, the theology of politics or something of that nature could easily pick up as a volume to kind of facilitate that conversation. And, we need to know that deep history. And we also need to point people to ways in which we've been discipled poorly and ways in which we can be discipled in the way of a first century Jewish marginalized man who got executed by the state, right? I mean, it's a big deal. And so love that. Thank you for that. And, I'll turn to Cy for a moment here, and I'd love to hear some of your hopes and some of the things that you have What are you dreaming about when you dream about this book going into the world?
So, I mean, a lot of what Jonathan and Susie said were also part of my reasons for being involved. Another thing, though, that I'm hoping that the book accomplishes, speaking of Jonathan talking about, talking to people and understanding, what they're downstream from, is I wanted us specifically to touch on a couple of topics that for people are the reasons that they feel tied to conservative politics, the reasons that they feel tied to Trump in particular, even if they don't necessarily want to be, right? I think there are a lot of people out there voting for Donald Trump because they believe they have to, even though they don't necessarily want to, right? So we go at a couple of issues, like, for instance, we have a few different essays on abortion, right? And we try and lay out a very clear case about how not voting for Donald Trump, or even voting for Joe Biden, or voting for the Democrats in general, it doesn't just have to be about this election, right? Does not mean that you are increasing the number of abortions in America, that you are fighting against, the only thing that matters in a lot of people's minds, which is overturning Roe versus Wade. That overturning Roe versus Wade wouldn't necessarily be that big of a dent in the actual number of abortions in America, that there are so many other factors that go into it, that the Democrats are actually a lot better on a lot of their policies when it comes to reducing abortions, and that the history of how abortion became like a single issue voter cause for a lot of Christians, actually has to do with power grabs made by people whose real intentions were trying to keep Christian schools segregated in the 1970s. Which if you have no idea what I'm talking about, then please go read the book, because that's an actual thing that happened. So we also talk about, we have an essay on critical race theory, right? Like, a lot of people right now are sort of scared of anyone talking. They're scared of people talking about racial justice, because they have been taught by a lot of leaders that there is some sinister, ideology trying to sneak its way into the church and destroy the gospel, whatever, right? So we have someone who clears that up and talks about what critical race theory actually is, and how the godfather of critical race theory was a Christian, and how there was, I said the godfather, that was the wrong word, the father of critical race. I said godfather.
It sounds way cooler though.
It does. I need more coffee. So anyways, we try to go at specific issues like that to sort of allow people to hear views that are outside of what they've just been taught, and hear that there are other perspectives, and you really can, in good faith, trying to follow the teachings of Jesus, not vote Republican. Even when it comes to the specifics of certain policies, right? We go into immigration, we go into racism, foreign policy, colonialism. Like, we're talking about a lot of different specific issues, because we do not believe that everyone who votes for Donald Trump is like some kind of cartoonishly evil person. Like, we understand that these are, that people are, there are many people out there trying to do their best. There are also many people out there acting in bad faith because they idolize power, and that happens too. But we're not trying to say that everyone who votes for Trump is evil. We're not trying to say that people are we're not trying to say that people are acting in bad faith, is what I'm saying. We're trying to take the other side seriously, take the position seriously, but at the same time being very firm that we think that Trumpism and the Christian support of Trump and that everything that's led up to it is actually evil. Whether or not it's the people who are caught up in that movement. I'm not saying, so it's a difference between sort of individuals and I guess the spiritual term would be powers and principalities.
Yeah.
It sounds like Maya wants to chip in, Jonathan.
Yeah, I turned the mic on because I got very excited.
Good. Go for it.
Because what Sai is talking about, like, is what the devil does. There's accusation and deception, right? And so if you think about like what the devil does on the front of idolatry is deceive, right? And so quote unquote Christians in America have been promised a certain thing, particularly white Christians and people who pursue whiteness and power. This is what you're promised, right? But on the backside of it, when you try to leave, then what you get is accusation. So a woman who's going to vote against her husband, you're not a Christian anymore. How dare you do this? Like, you're rebelling against the conformity of your wife. Like, you run into the patriarchy, you run into the gender discrimination, you run into the sexual violence. Like, all of that is a part of it. And it is the devil. When we talk about powers and principalities, like, that's what we're talking about, which is why the book goes beyond like this moment, because the battle is won by Jesus, but the devil's going to take as many people as he possibly can. And so how do we actually call out the deception and point to truth? You know, because Trump standing up, the article that was written in the New York Times by our great reporter Caitlin Beatty, maybe, that talked about Trump standing in a church at Iowa and saying, "If I'm in power, you will have power." Right? And that's deception. That is the devil when Jesus came out of the desert saying, "Follow me and you will have all of this." Right?
Absolutely.
So I got excited because, Sai was couching when he was saying it in some scripture. So I got excited. So
Hey, love that. No, and I think that's a good word that I did a sermon a couple of weeks ago on that passage you're talking about, and it's become very important to me when I think about the theology of political engagement, right? Jesus has offered all of the power of the kingdoms of the world, and Jesus doesn't correct Satan's theology and just says, nah, don't want that. But you also see it's not as though Jesus will withdraw from those kingdoms. He'll engage them until they kill him, right? And so there's this sort of like, I don't want that system. It's not what I need, but I'm going to engage them because there's real people who need something better than these systems have offered them. And I think that first century reality translates to now in so many ways. And so this is already rich, and we're at the big picture level, and that's good. That's good. I love it. And so maybe I have a few things that maybe we could talk about in the rest of our conversation. Of course, we could go line by line. I mean, you probably have something you could say about every one of these essays because there's so much richness in this book. But what I think we could consider talking about are a few things. I think, Sai, to your point about wanting to like speak to those Christians who feel locked by certain topics. I think before Trump, and probably, as Obama was being elected the first time back in 2008, I think a lot of what I heard was abortion and LGBTQ stuff. Well, LGBTQ stuff's already kind of been decided. Obviously, we worry about rights being overturned in other ways later, but like it's less of a focal point now. But race has really sort of supplemented that sort of either enthusiasm for rethinking our politic if we come from a more conservative space, or that resistance I was talking about, that negative resistance. And so I wonder if we could start with abortion, because I'll tell you the truth, that was my big hang up. When I was in college, that was it. I've told the story in various places, but I was 2004. I had Bush 04 sticker on the back of my little car that I eventually had to give to the California government because it was a gross polluter, and they smashed it flat and gave me a little bit of cash for it. Yeah, weird program, liberal program, I'm sure. And so that was what I was brought up on, but I was also brought up on compassion. I was a child who depended on, with my single mom, welfare, food stamps, Section 8 housing, right? So like I knew that as a Jesus person, it was more complex than it's often painted. And somewhere leading toward between 04 and 08, my heart and my imagination were open to the reality that Jesus calls us to something much more radical and robust and complex and nuanced. And but then there was abortion, and that was like the end of the line for me. I was, deeply concerned that I would be unfaithful if I voted for Obama that first term, and ended up coming to a place which I think the book highlights pretty well, where I could say, I disagree with the platform of the Democratic Party on this issue, but it seems as though Democratic policies actually help reduce abortions more than the alternative has. And so I would love to step in and just hear from you, and you can, maybe Susie, we'll start with you since it's been a few since we heard from you, and then just kind of free float some conversation as you feel led. But what does this book really say to the person who is like, I don't like most of the Republican stuff anymore, but abortion seems huge because we're talking about millions of unborn lives in the womb, right? We're not just talking about, and they'll do the math and be like, well, this is more than that. Okay. That's my little rant and reflection. Please, Susie, do something. Take the mic away from me, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're definitely right to touch on abortion as sort of one of the critical discussions that is relevant to Christian political engagement. That probably even just goes without saying. But so we have 4, I think, really excellent essays in the book that go directly at that. One by David French, one by Randall Balmer, the historical piece that Cy was alluding to, and then 2 really powerful anonymous essays. And also going back to this idea that this is not just about the Trump administration, this is about dispensations that have been handed down to us from previous generations and have been building up over the decades. And part of that is just this false, seemingly cemented in dichotomy of, quote, pro-life versus, quote, pro-choice.
Yeah.
And that was not handed to people from the Bible. That's not written anywhere. And I think one thing we can all agree on is that the abortion discussion is where nuance goes to die. Mm-hmm. And there is such a lack of compassion for the other side and such a lack of empathy. And so we wanted to not only have the discussion as it's pertinent to the current election, but to have the discussion to try to disrupt that and complicate it and critique it and come to a more productive place of a policy platform that can actually, as you said, bring down the abortion rate, if that's what you're passionate about. Because if you look at the facts, the platform that a lot of people who claim to be against abortion, the platform they're arguing for is not what's going to get them there. And so one of the things we wanted to do is, as Cy said so importantly, not hating against folks who are out in the streets protesting against these things or who take a strong stance, but to let them know that in many ways they're being used and they've been hoodwinked. Because the discussion is not about what you think it's about. And this is where I think my background and my context for a lot of this is my most recent experience politically in Lebanon. And I heard someone say, a professor once made this amazing comment about Lebanon, that it's a place where you could be sitting playing checkers across from someone, and then suddenly you realize that you're really just a pawn on somebody else's chessboard.
Whoa.
And so you have to realize that for you, it may seem like a very black and white conversation that you're having and a black and white battle that you're fighting, but there are powers that be that are using you in their political chess game. And you need to be cognizant of that. And so we need to be informed voters as followers of Christ. Being a part of the kingdom of God is not our ticket to disengage from the world.
That's right.
I think contrary to that, we really need to dig in and do our homework and to be aware of what's going on around us and how we can actually contribute to an ethic that is pro-life in every sense of that word, that is pro undocumented immigrants who are struggling, and children who are growing up in fear, and to families who are struggling to put food on the table and to make a living wage, and to families who are fearful for the outcome of this election because they don't know if their life will now be worth less than someone else walking down the street just because of the color of their skin. And so we need to realize what pro-life actually means. And if we want to find out what that means, we need to go back to the Bible and disengage ourselves from some of the lies that have built up over time.
Wow. Powerful. And thank you for your comment about stepping in and engaging and really confronting the very complex issues that are associated with things like abortion, and it speaks to, I don't know you very well, Susie. We know this already, but you've given significant time of your life contributing in ways to marginalized persons across the world, and I know you must have brought in a bit of a global perspective to this very focused American politics thing, because really this is very American. Like the situation we find ourselves in is so just centered on one lens at looking at reality. And your point to like, hey, we've got to look at all the angles here. Like we can't just be fixed on our story. Anyway, it was just dawning on me. Well, yeah, and Susie can probably see that in a unique way. Having been someone who's been in global context outside of this country, who's still very passionate about the way we engage in this country. So thank you for that. I don't know if I was told that you're pretty humble, so I'm trying to say nice things.
Thank you for that, Kurt. And
Yeah.
I will say that, to your point, it's ironic that I ended up involved in a project like this, because for so long growing up as a missionary kid, I sort of fought against this ethnocentrism and patriotism and nationalism that has infiltrated the church, the American church, and sort of wanted nothing to do with American politics for a long time. 'Cause I thought, come on, guys, wake up. We're not the only people living in the world. Having said that, I then had to reconcile myself to the fact that the United States is still the global superpower today. And we do have a disproportionate impact on the rest of the world. And that also applies to our theology. So part of what I saw again in Lebanon was that, to your point about you and Jonathan, we're talking about seminary textbooks that go out. And we export our bad theology to the rest of the world. And I would tell you that some of the most diehard Trump fans that I know today don't live in the United States. They live in the Middle East. Wow. And that may sound crazy to some people, but that is a fact. And so the stakes are so high when it comes to us really trying to do the work and come back to a place of true biblical allegiance, not allegiance to our own partisan politics, because what we determine to be gospel-centered will then be sent out to the rest of the world. And so I think that's also something that's so critical to keep in mind as we engage with these issues.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Thank you so much. And, thinking about these issues where we've been talking about abortion, and I'm curious, before we move on to another topic here, if either Jonathan or Sai, I know Sai, you've kind of spoken to it some. Do either of you have anything you'd want to add to kind of this abortion sort of fork in the road that a lot of Christians seem to face?
I'll speak very quickly because Susie was amazing. I think that there's the historical narratives that we have to address. There's the disinformation that needs to be addressed. But Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And there's a passage in it that says, at some point, like, you don't need to tell a Black person to go to the back of the bus. Their very will like take them there automatically. And wow. I think what we actually need to address is the miseducation of the white church, like to actually be re-discipled, because what you talked about, that's an emotional response of like, will I be condemned if I do this? That has nothing to do with the gospel and everything to do with like how we're encultured into a church. And very, very rarely did I ever see in scripture Jesus damn someone.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, who was excommunicated?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And even to go so far as like, we condemn Judas. Jesus did not condemn Judas. Right? So like, what would it look like for us to actually like roll back the theology of condemnation that has been rolled out and say, okay, like, what does it look like for us to address the emotional wounds as people leave communities that will ostracize them for being different, for dissenting? And that's where I think the abortion debate has to move. because there's a generation of people who are angry, who are sad, and who are really, really hurt because on the other side of the abortion debate are women. On the other side are men that have had to have these hard conversations, and we need to be able to have robust discipleship to let people know they're still welcome at the table of communion. Literally, you're still welcome at the table of communion. So anyway,
thank you. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, wow. Yeah, and Sai, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'll try and be brief, but we talk or the authors in the book talk about how, actually, like when it comes down to numbers, overturning Roe versus Wade does not mean that abortion is illegal now, right? It just means there's not a constitutional right to it. It means that the states get to decide state by state, what their policies are going to be. In New York, the New York Constitution, you have a right to an abortion, right? So it doesn't matter what you do, Roe versus Wade. In New York, you still have that right. And it's going to be that way in a whole lot of places. That's just where I am, right? But that's what it's going to be around the country. There were abortions before Roe. If Roe goes away, there will be abortions after Roe. The question is, how much, at least as far as I'm concerned, the question is who's going to reduce the numbers the most. The article by David French in our book, cite studies basically saying you overturn Roe versus Wade, you're looking at maybe a 12 or 13% decrease in the amount of abortions in the U.S., which is not insignificant, but it is not the be all end all alpha and omega solution to the problem that people think it is.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
So yeah. So there's that, just like you need to dig into the numbers. I've heard a couple people like arguing just sort of, you can't vote for someone who supports abortion, like Joe Biden. Like it doesn't, the numbers sort of don't matter. I think that's just kind of like that's just moral purity sort of, it's just saying like, which I think is ridiculous. Like you vote for anyone who's going to run the government of the world's biggest superpower, and you are voting in, that person is going to enact something that is not in line with the Bible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You cannot avoid that. We're not voting for Jesus here. We're voting for fallen people and fallen parties who are going to do things that are bad. And we need to be smart about who we're voting for and what the actual outcomes of those votes will be. I also think it's important for white Christians in particular to think about the fact of how, like, to take seriously the fact that Christians who are not white in large part are voting for Democrats and have been for a very long time. And, not just hand wave that away, not just think that that's, that they're just not thinking about what we're thinking about. They're not getting it right. Think about really take seriously the fact that your brothers and sisters are trying to faithfully vote in line with their faith, and they're not coming out in the same place as you, and then not just hand wave that away, because like I think if you dig into that, ultimately what you're going to find is some racism. I just recently read, I was talking to Jonathan and Susie about a piece that Al Mohler wrote, who's the president, I think, of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he had in one of his case for voting for Trump, he said that voting for Joe Biden was outside of his moral imagination. And in the very next sentence, the very next paragraph, he starts talking about how he recognizes that the Black church, by and large, is going to vote for Biden and has voted Democrat for a long time. And, how he doesn't condemn them. And he just kind of moves on. And I'm like, okay, so you're basically saying that the vast majority of what Black Christians do in America is outside of your moral imagination. Like, you need to stop. You need to stop, and you need to think about why you're saying that, and how you literally cannot empathize with a huge chunk of your brothers and sisters in America. And, you're like what you're actually saying about them and what you really think about their faith, their intelligence, their whatever it is. So I think that is, it's just you have to take seriously the perspectives of everyone in your church. I think it just kind of goes along with the idea that the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. Like you need to listen. And that's reciprocal too. But I'm just saying, you need, if your perspective, your particular perspective is dismissing, huge swaths of your own church along racial lines, something's probably wrong there. Yeah. That's something you need to think about.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, your point on moral purity, and, I think so many people put so much stock in their vote as they over Christianize their vote in the wrong way, right? Like there's this sense like, for me now, I want to vote in ways that, have listened to people who have, are marginalized and have, situations that differ from mine. As a white middle-class male dude, the reality is a lot of the policies don't affect my situation like it does a lot of other people. And I just want to be a good listener. That's something I've really tried to learn in the last 5 or 6 years. And it breaks. And I bring this up to people in my sphere quite often, that it really breaks my heart that there are Christian pastors in this country. They are theologically, not that I want to slice it this way in any way except for example, but theologically conservative people that are Black or other races, right? That are saying like, hey, like systemic racism is real. These issues are real. They really affect communities of color. And I'm just going to tell you that it's, and it just breaks my heart that we only listen to a specific stream of thought often that affirms our previously held convictions, because and there's a lot of reasons. Keeps us feeling safe, secure, and all of that. And so thank you for bringing that up. And I think it does dovetail into the other sort of conversation about critical race theory. And let me ask you all this. Do you remember back when Obama was up for election, Glenn Beck was all the rage back then on the right. And remember him doing these like chalkboard like talks, like he was like a, I don't know. Why did Rob Bell Yeah. Rob Bell came to mind, not just because he's done some of those big whiteboard presentations that were cool. Yeah. And then you get Glenn Beck doing this stuff and it's like, bro, that's not cool. But anyway, and I remember him having this whole rant on if your pastor says social justice, you need to leave your church, right? Yep. And this anti-social justice thing. Well, now, I mean, we're getting regurgitated versions of that, but it's about critical race theory. If your community of faith is talking in critical race theory sorts of ways, that is not a faithful church. That is, whatever one might hold. And so here's the question to really bring. How do we step into this conversation with folks who are open-minded, but also are hearing those voices that are saying this is anti-Christian? How do we step into that wisely in ways that may actually be able to, persuade them that race really is a significant issue and it has been for 400 years? Jonathan, I'm going to look to you first. You wrote an essay sort of highlighting some of this. You've already alluded to it with the Jerry Falwell sort of connections, but help us kind of just step into that in any way that you feel might resonate and be helpful.
Yeah, this is my opinion and perspective. This is not KTF's perspective, because I think some people might get upset with what I'm about to say.
Sure.
So I will own the words. I think what actually needs to happen is people need to be willing to leave. And I don't mean leave the church or leave Jesus, but I mean literally relocate out of like institutions that participate in what I call white American folk religion. Right. So if you are willing to divest your money out of a seminary and go somewhere else to be educated under the leadership of other people, if you are willing to move, right? That's why missions is quote unquote so risky and idolized by the American church. It's like, you're willing to go live there? Like you're willing to go be with those people, right? So embedded in our empowerment of missionaries is a racist assumption, right? Like is the assumption of danger, is the assumption of risk, is the assumption of threat, is the assumption of criminality, right? And Susie writes about all of this, right? And so I think what needs to happen is we need to move. And that is what Jesus did. He incarnated, right? This all goes back to Jesus. And so I think white Christians and any Christian that has bought into a cultured a cultured perspective of Christianity. So that I think that includes Black Christians, because we all know what I am Black. Y'all can't hear that. Some of you might be able to recognize that because this is America, you know, Black people sound like, but like the reality of like, there's a Black cultural Christianity. There's a Chinese cult, there's a Korean, like, but it's downstream of white supremacy, right? And so we have to be able to say, I'm going to relocate out of where culture tells me I belong and go sit at the feet of those who have been set free in the way that I need to be liberated.
Wow.
And if white people are willing to do that and maintain the relationships they have with their uncles, their cousins, their friends, because what usually happens is when we disagree with people, we move away and we don't come back except for the holidays. And then we don't say anything that's quote unquote controversial. And that's the problem. Right. And so what I am hoping is that followers of Jesus will leave the institutions that are broken and messed up to be healed and reconciled to one another, themselves and God, and then begin to minister to the people who are still in cages. And that, because that, like, it's actual captivity to sin. It's captivity to sin. And so can we actually share a gospel that liberates people as opposed to gives people golden handcuffs? Right. It's just a fundamentally different way of calling people to liberation. And so, yeah, that's what I would say. Like we need to leave, you know?
Yeah. No, that's well said. And I think, I appreciate, both the big picture you're painting, like this withdrawal and move towards something liberative in nature, right? Like don't be part of those spaces, but also, you had this comment, but stay in relationship to your uncles, your aunts, that to me is this really important sort of thing for my own life. We'll move towards this eventually, but like I have so many relatives that are voting for Donald Trump and it grieves me. But as you all have kind of said in different ways, these folks are lovely human beings in so many ways. But they are so blinded by their context and life and stuff in so many ways, and so I just really resonate with kind of the double thread there. But I do think what you're calling for is radical for some people, but it looks like Jesus in so many ways. And so thank you for speaking that. And feel free, anyone who wants to chime in on the conversation about critical race theory or racism, since it is with abortion the two kind of hot button issues, which I hate even talking about things like that, because the truth is issues aren't issues. Like these are about human lives and have been for so long. And so, yeah, other thoughts on this particular point of conversation?
I guess I'll just jump in because Jonathan alluded to the piece that I wrote in the book, and certainly Jonathan and Sai, I think, can speak much more powerfully to this than I can. But what I've been sort of grappling with as a white woman is how do I grow out of these contexts and even theologies that I've been fed throughout my Christian life that are rooted in white supremacy. And to be honest, it's an ongoing struggle. It's kind of, I say this almost in a funny way, but it's a little bit true throughout this project. There were times where I'd text something to the guys or we'd have a conversation. I think in my head, WWJT, what would Jonathan think? And because he gets things that I still don't get. And sometimes I say things that I'm like, wait, that's not, why did I just say that? And you do have to work through this, a lot of cognitive dissonance and with a lot of humility and, daily repentance and praying for the transforming and renewing of your mind. And, but what my piece digs into is this idea, it's called When Religion Becomes Idolatry. And it talks about sort of a critique of this concept of Christian worldview that has been so popularized in our Christian schools and in our churches in the United States. And just calling out the fact that that's really, it can become a dangerous thing because given human nature, when we think we're creating a system that helps us live out our lives in more biblically rooted ways, oftentimes what we're actually doing is creating a system that remakes God in our own image. And And so these easy answers that we've developed over time are actually systems that we've just created to protect our way of life and to protect our sense of our own identity and place in the world. And these are systems that do violence to our brothers and sisters in Christ who are unlike us, and violence just to, other people in the world who are created in the image of God, that inhibit our ability to fundamentally uphold the Imago Dei in all of God's creation. And so really trying to dig deep into that and ask ourselves, what does that look like in the United States today? And I think today, it absolutely looks like white supremacy. It looks like Trumpism and everything that comes out of that, the xenophobia and homophobia that has come out of the church. The uncritical evaluations of foreign policy that you talked about. There's definitely a racial element to that as well. There's another phenomenal piece in the book by Jesse Wheeler that called Bad Theology Kills. And he talks about, he touches on a lot of great stuff, but just this idea that when you dehumanize Arab people, you are allowing for these policies that allow you to use just war theory to go overseas and indiscriminately kill people in ways that are not only counter to international law, counter to the teachings of the Bible and the ethic of Christ and the calling of the church. And when you see that up close, you start to see how evil that really is. But at a distance, what it looks like is the banality of evil, that it's lurking in our pews every single day and we don't even recognize it. It's become domesticated in the United States. And so that, that's certainly another big question that we're trying to dig into and hopefully bring about some transformative reflection on.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I think the tie to the global spaces within which whiteness influence, violence elsewhere, as well as, oppression here. I think it's such a important link, whether it's tied to, certain versions of Zionism here, or if it's tied to, what we've talked about a little bit, Randall Ballmer's kind of contribution about the fact that there was segregated schools at stake. So we've got to come up with this thing to rally around. So how about abortion? There are always, there have been historically forces at work that really bend our political and theological imaginations towards things that we think are holy, but they're really, really just ungodly in so many respects and dehumanize so many people in the process. So thank you for highlighting some of that. And, as we kind of move towards the back end of a conversation here, well, here's one of the things I wanted to bring up. So like, for instance, I'm looking right now at table of contents. I see Randall Ballmer, I see David French. And I know I recently listened to a debate David French had with, the guy who wrote
Metaxas.
Metaxas. I was going to say the guy who wrote the bad Bonhoeffer biography.
I thought you were going to say the guy who wrote VeggieTales.
Oh, no, not Phil. No.
Eric Metaxas was also a writer on VeggieTales.
Oh, yeah, he was a writer. That's very weird. But yes, he was.
Yeah.
Especially given Phil's kind of posture these days.
They've ended up in very different places.
Yeah, I'd totally forgotten that. What comes to mind here, and please feel free to bring race back in, bring any other issue that is relevant back in that contribute, that's part of the book's ethos. But what I heard in David French was definitely anti-Trump. But my sense from him, at least, was I don't know that he was going to go Biden. I think he was going to go third party or not at all. Like he was a withdrawal. Yeah. So that's interesting to me. That's not my posture, but I think, I was having a conversation with someone about it, and I said, well, if like the majority of people who voted for Trump the first time chose David French's posture of just not voting, that might not be too bad in a sense. I don't know how numbers work. I'm not a statistician or whatever. My GRE in math is my daughter will be better at passing that in probably about 4 or 5 years. So, it's not my expertise, but I'm just curious about, as you bring all of these essays together, what is the actual invitation when it comes to voting? And certainly there will be opinions represented in our little panel discussion here. But my guess is that there is some, there will be diverse possibilities for people who want to take some of these issues very seriously. I'm just curious if anyone has reflections on that.
First of all, caveat, I have no personal knowledge of how David French is voting.
Sure.
I'm just guessing. I would guess based on his public statements that he's not voting for Biden, but I don't actually know. But I will say, so we intentionally, and we said this in the intro to the book, we have people who disagree with each other within our pages, right? And we do not agree with everything that was said by all of our authors. I don't, we were not endorsing any one candidate.
Right.
We can have, endless arguments about whether or not it's, people might say that voting for a third party is irresponsible or privileged, right? People might say that just only ever voting for the two major parties is, why we're in the mess that we're in and why things will never change. Like, you can go back and forth all day long on those issues. I have a view. I don't know that but we're not necessarily trying to plug any one view on that, right? Like, the point of the book was to say that there are people from all of these different backgrounds who are not voting for Donald Trump, who are saying that this is his candidacy and Christian support of him is a manifestation of a whole bunch of problems that we have in the church, and we need to move in a different direction immediately. And, we were just sort of trying to undermine the general kind of media narrative that Christians support Trump no matter what. I don't know, like, we have a whole section from a few different authors on, like, discernment in voting, and like another one on Christian political discourse. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to give any, like, really specific way that we are asking people to vote, other than to say we are trying to extract Christian voting from the discipleship of American politics and try and relocate it in the discipleship of Jesus, right? And the scriptures and the things that God actually cares about. And we're trying to get people to think about what the difference between those two things are, right? Like, having the ability to separate what Jesus says and what the Republican National Convention says, the Democratic National Convention says, or what different American ideology, American exceptionalism, or the notion that America is a meritocracy, or all these things that come from not the Bible at all, that come from our culture. So I think that's probably where I would land. We were just trying to give people a number of different examples of ways to do that. And even though our authors, are probably going to land in a few different places in terms of how they actually vote.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I'll speak quickly because I agree with most of what Sai said. I just want to drill down further in that I think I was one who advocated for French's essay. And it's because, like, I debated David French for a Veritas forum some years ago. I was in a meeting because of the journalism school at the City College School of Journalism with the editor of the New York Times, and he said, the editor at the time, he's not there anymore, and he said, who are the conservative voices that we should be listening to? And because he said, we don't know who to call, right? Because it's not that people can't find conservative voices. It's difficult to find conservative voices that are thoughtful.
Yeah.
That and I am not saying that conservative writers are stupid or ignorant or anti-intellectual or any of those things. But what I am saying is that listening to Ben Shapiro every day does not make you more thoughtful.
That's right.
Listening to Fox News daily does not make you more thoughtful.
Donald Trump.
Listening to Rush Limbaugh, listening to conservative talk radio does not make you more thoughtful. It makes you more angry. It makes you more afraid. It makes you more anxious. It makes you more entrenched. It makes you less likely to think critically. And these are statistically proven things. when engaging with content. Similarly, the opposite things happen when you engage with just, people on the left. Like if you only read the left hook or only read Jacobin or only read, like you're going to end up in a place that is just inauthentic, and you get into the moral purity that Sai mentioned earlier. So I think when I give someone this book, what I am standing behind for all these authors is these people are willing to think critically about what they're writing. They're willing to source what they're writing. And in 5 years, they're not going to change like Lindsey Graham to maintain power in some way. David French enlisted in the military and went to Iraq, right? Like David French is going to adopt children. David French, to me, I disagree with him vehemently on many of the things that he would espouse, particularly poverty and the work to like government reform. But I deeply respect his faith, and I know he's thought about it. And so that is what I think I would want the people who pick up the book to do, is to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, right? Like think about the things that you're doing, and then don't have a disembodied theology that allows you to believe one thing and then completely act another way, because that's what Jesus said about the Pharisees. Like you whitewashed tomb, you are full of bones. On the outside, you look great, but inside you are dead. And we need to call people to live fully into the kingdom of God, not just with our brains and Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Thank you. Wow. I want to give you all just one last chance to speak about where do we go from here? And what I'm curious about, today as of recording, and I'm going to try and get this out pretty soon, but as of recording, it is literally election day. And so we're sitting here. We don't know what those results will be. We might not know for a while, depending on how this all works out, or we might know really soon. And I think a lot of us are hoping we know really soon. Whatever the case may be, let's talk about beyond for a moment. As we kind of started with that theme, I want to kind of close with that theme. If someone's listening to this and Donald Trump has been reelected, what does the beyond look like? What are we invited into during the next 4 years? And, I think we could do the same thing with Joe Biden, but it would be a different kind of thing, simply because of the gravity that many of us feel around Donald Trump in particular. So let's just stick with Trump. He actually wins. And now we as followers of Jesus in this country have 4 new years to step in. What does that invite us into? Susie, if you'd like to go.
Oh, okay. I think I'll start by trying to link it to some of the things you all were saying a minute ago, and then sort of bring it forward a little bit. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to jump right in. I think it looks like I think it looks like a theology of resistance, and this is where I'll link it to what you all were just talking about. I find it so ironic that in the church today, we're seeing this rhetoric of sort of, why can't we all just come together across the divide and, agree to disagree, and it's fine. You voted for this candidate, I voted for that candidate. We all just need to love each other. And isn't that what peacemaking looks like? And prior to that, I remember growing up hearing a lot of discussions around concerns within the church around this idea of sort of moral relativism. And this idea that, you have your truth and I have mine, and it's fine. And being taught that that's not okay. We see in the Bible that there are some things that just are true and some things that are fundamentally untrue. There is something that is called moral objective truth, and it is absolute and it is eternal. And I think there is a place for followers of Christ to say that this is not okay. This will never be what love looks like. This will never be what justice looks like. This will never be the politics of Jesus. And to understand that peacemaking at times is disruptive. it's there's a phrase that Jonathan uses that I've just sort of adopted as my own. He talks about being lovingly disruptive. It doesn't mean that you need to come out hating people. In fact, I think it embraces an ethic of radical subversive love.
Yeah.
But it is still firm in standing its ground. And I think that that's the kind of politics of resistance that the church needs to adopt. And in terms of what I would love to see happen, you know, it is likely that regardless of the outcome, you talked about a scenario where Trump comes out and is reelected. Regardless of what happens, you know, polls are showing that it's likely that he will have been supported by, say, 78% or more of white evangelical Christians in this election. That was Pew's, I think, most recent poll, and of white evangelical support. And I would love to see those numbers get flipped, because that will mean that we've been able to start to disentangle the church from these idolatries of, you know, white American folk religion and white supremacy, and an ethic that, as we've said, is not really pro-life, that is not really loving your neighbor, that is not really embracing, as you alluded to earlier, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Let's get back to what it really means to live out the politics of Jesus, and let's be willing to call a spade a spade. And that is a prophetic work. And I think that it's one that we need to take up, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be painful, and it will challenge the ways that we love people, because it will not always be easy or without friction. But friction just means that you're getting somewhere. And I think we need to get from where we are today to where God is calling us to be in the future. And it's not here.
Wow. Wow. You just painted a vision. Woo. You all feeling that? Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. Couple of moments for response, real quick, Jonathan, Sai, and then we'll kind of wrap up here.
Yes and amen. That is all I have to say. Yes and amen.
Awesome.
I think I will echo everything that she says, in that there needs to be an organized, engaged, radical resistance that looks like the politics of Jesus. And I will go a little bit further to talk about the cost in that remembering that Jesus died, remembering that Paul was killed, remembering that Daniel ended up in a lion's den. I think the theology of comfort versus like the reality of suffering, and when Jesus, promises all these things, he says, and persecutions, like Christians in America do not know what persecution is. Like, somebody coming for you on Twitter is not persecution if you follow Jesus. That's right. Okay, like we can call my Christian friends in Iran if we want to talk about persecution, right? Or call like the church planters in Jordan that are in full-on burqas all the time, right? We need to understand, like, we need to prepare for what it looks like to actually count the cost and follow Jesus. And I'm excited for that, because we have real examples of people who are doing it. Some of them in the book, like, that have made sacrifices to follow Jesus. And so I think Jesus has prepared us for this moment. And I'm excited and daunted to see what that looks like. Very similar to the people who were filled with the Spirit at Pentecost. Excited, but like, what is happening? That stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow. And thanks to your little kiddo. Thanks to your little kiddo, I was saying I've loved having her in the background, and it just,
she's feeding her baby right now.
Hey, love it. So much like my life. Love it. Thanks for that. And Sai, any last parting words here on this?
I think we're gonna have what Jonathan just said. Our idea in America of being persecuted right now, at least in the conservative white church, is, that you might have to sell a cake to a gay wedding. that you might have to,
right.
You might lose your tax exempt status for something or other. I mean, if you actually understand free exercise clause law, I'm an attorney by training. There's almost zero chance of a lot of what Christians are afraid of actually happening. But when Jonathan talks about the theology of comfort, the idea that you need to vote, you need to get out there and rally around someone who is going to protect you from that as a Christian, from the horror of having to bake a cake for a gay wedding or whatever it is that you're afraid of, of facing consequences for something that you believe, and making sure that you fight that tooth and nail. That I think is a sort of political theology of comfort. And it, I think, demonstrates, Jonathan just said, Jesus has prepared us. Jonathan, I think, was referring to a specific group of people who said that. I think we are wildly unprepared.
You're right. I was talking about Black people. You're right. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to be clear,
a specific
and thank you
group
for that.
of people, I said vaguely. Okay, if you're talking about the Black church, it's not just prepared. It's been through it many times over for hundreds of years, right? And so, and the idea that we in the white church are afraid of the, being fined for something or whatever, like those are our greatest fears, is again, I think, the idea that you're just taking the experience of the Black church that has been burned and bombed and enslaved and everything for centuries, and you're just going, well, that just, don't even think about it. Throw that out the window. That doesn't matter to me. I'm not, you have all of these Christians, allegedly your brothers and sisters all across the country, who have been through actual persecution, actual trials, actual suffering, mostly at your hands, historically speaking.
Yeah. And,
we're just terrified that public schools are going to tell our kids that it's okay to be trans or whatever the fear is. So I think, breaking down dividing lines, which is something that the gospel tells us to do anyways, is going to be crucial. Being able to talk to the entire church, listen to the entire church, and like I said before, set aside those things that we have gotten from the discipleship of our culture and our power and our privilege. Set those things aside and make sure that what you're being discipled by is Jesus and the church as a whole, not just the church that you're used to listening to, is going to be crucial in how we move forward, regardless of who's president. Because like we said at the beginning, like Trump is just a manifestation of something that's been happening for a very long time. Whether he's, and I even think if Joe Biden is elected, I think a lot of people are going to breathe a sigh of relief and just go back to how they were before. Right?
Right. Complacency sets in, right? For a lot of people
I think complacency is going to set in hard. And for a little bit, I understand. Look, if he's elected, we can all take a nap for a couple of weeks or whatever. Right? Yeah. Like some
people need some rest. Yeah.
I understand people who are going to exhale if that happens, if Trump's, but I think it's going to be a pretty radical shift if you don't want, in the end, the white evangelical church to be a branch that is cut off and thrown in the fire, to be perfectly frank. And wow. We've talked about this on other podcasts too, but like that can happen, and it doesn't matter. When I'm saying that can happen, I mean the branch can be cut off and thrown in the fire, and it makes no difference to God, to God's mission, to the advancement of God's kingdom. Right, God cares about the people, obviously, who are in those churches, in those pews, but like it does not make a difference to his mission if the American church just vanishes. And we have to remember that, and we have to be seeking after God and not seeking after our own power.
Wow. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. My goodness, this has been a rich conversation, and it's probably one of my first that I've gotten to do with multiple people like this. So this has been really like fun for me too, just as an interview person or whatever. But really, I believe you've given folks a resource and gift during a very, very challenging season that's going to continue to be challenging no matter the outcomes, and inviting us into real critical thought so that we can thoughtfully engage. And I really appreciate that. The book, again, is called Keeping the Faith, Reflections on Politics and Christianity in the Era of Trump and Beyond. Jonathan, Susie, Sai, thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.